Well, if everybody else can wear masks, so can I. Okay, I'm going to provide the link to this in the description, and if you want to go read it yourself and are annoyed by someone reading for you, go ahead and just follow that link, and then you can just read it yourself. But I'm going to read it for people who like to watch videos and have stuff read to them. But I'm not going to say the title. You can just see what it is right here at the top. There's the title right there at the top. And I'm going to use substitute words. So I'm not actually saying certain things, and you can follow along with me. The you-know-what simulation machine. Why the inventor of the you-know-what test would have warned us not to use it to detect a you-know-what. Scientists are doing an awful lot of damage to the world in the name of helping it. I don't mind attacking my own fraternity because I am ashamed of it. Kary Mullis, inventor of polymerase chain reaction. And I might say this, I might pronounce things wrong because I haven't actually heard them be said with my own ears yet. So I apologize if I'm pronouncing things the wrong way. The knowledge is still in my head, I just may not know how to read it right. If I say it wrong, at least you know what I'm talking about. And I'm showing it here in writing. What do we mean when we say somebody has tested positive for the you-know-what? You-know-what? The answer would astound you. But getting this answer is like getting to a very rare mushroom that only grows above 200 feet on a sequoia tree in the forbidden forest. I say that for dramatic effect, but also because I wound up, against all odds, finding it. Every day I wake up and work at shedding one more layer of ignorance by listening carefully. I got lucky with scientists many years ago. Epic, incredible scientists happening to cross my path when nobody else wanted to talk to them. Now their names are emerging, their warnings and corrections crystallizing. True science, the nature of the natural world, is never bad news. Globalist science is nothing but bad news. The reason, bad guy in mention, wants you to believe a you-know-what will exterminate over 450 million people is that he hates nature, God, and you, a subjective interpretation. Why is that? You'd have to ask his psychiatrist. But let's talk about the latest terror bomb detonated by global atheist PC creeps upon you perfectly good free life as a U.S. citizen in 2020, governed by a president who does not think backwards. How many of us are so-called infected with this novel you-know-what, and how scared should we be? First, a spiritual law. Anything that tries to frighten you comes from opposition in spiritual battle. It's not the Holy Spirit, period. Ignore its threats and keep your wits about you. You don't have to shout, "Stay safe," to your neighbors. We are safe. We have an immune system that is a miracle like the Sistine Chapel. It withstands toxic microbial inundation on a grand scale at all times, while operating a superhighway of adaptive life-sustaining genetic information on cellular bridges, emitting telegrams of vital evolutionary code, slandered as viruses or retroviruses. People die, yes, but people don't die the way you-know-who, bad guy in mention, would have you believe, at the mercy of malicious predatory pathogens lurking on every surface, and especially other humans. That's not science. That's social engineering, terrorism. Let's proceed. What do we mean when we say a person tests positive for you know what? We don't actually mean they've been found to have it. We've been hijacked by our technologies, but left illiterate about what they actually mean. In this case, I am in the rare position of having known, spent time with, and interviewed the inventor of the method used in the presently available you-know-what tests, which is called PCR. And then you can see right down below what that stands for. His name was Cary B. Mullis, and he was one of the warmest, funniest, most eclectic-minded people I ever met. In addition to being a staunch critic of HIV science and an unlikely Nobel laureate, i.e. a genius. Again, I apologize if I pronounced that wrong. One time in 1994, when I called to talk to him about how PCR was being weaponized to prove almost a decade after it was asserted that HIV caused AIDS, he actually came to tears. The people who have taken all your freedoms away in recent weeks, they're social engineers, politicians, globalist thought leaders, bankers, WHO fanatics, and the like. Their army is composed of mainstream media, which is now literally a round-the-clock perfect propaganda machine for the bad guy-led pandemic. And again, I don't know how to pronounce this. Guess I shouldn't be reading it unless I know how to pronounce words. Cary Mullis, what I'm going to proceed to read anyway. Cary Mullis was a scientist. He never spoke like a globalist and said once, memorably, when accused of making statements about HIV that could endanger lives, "I'm a scientist. I am not a lifeguard." That's a very important line in the sand. Somebody who goes around claiming they are saving lives is a very dangerous animal, and you should run into the opposite direction when you encounter them. Their weapon is fear, and their favorite word is could. They entrap you with a form of bio-debt, creating simulations of every imaginable thing that could happen, yet hasn't. Bad guy in mention has been waiting a long time for a virus with this much, as he put it, pandemic potential. But bad guy in mention has a problem, and it's called PCR. Of Mullen's invention, polymerase chain reaction, the London Observer wrote, "Not since James Watt walked across Glasgow Green in 1765 and realized that the secondary steam condenser would transform steam power, an inspiration that set loose the Industrial Revolution, has a single momentous idea been so recorded in time and place." What does HIV have to do with you know what? Okay. PCR played a central role in the HIV war, a war you don't know about that lasted 22 years between globalist postmodern HIV scientists and classical scientists. The latter lost the war. Unless you count being correct as winning. The relentless, violent finale silenced the opposition, and it seemed nobody would ever learn who these scientists were or why they fought this thing so adamantly and passionately. And PCR, though its inventor died last year and isn't here to address it, plays a central role in, you know what, terrorism. Okay, before I go down and read further, I'm going to play this video.
The first time I really questioned it, I was working on a project where we were measuring HIV in people's blood at this place called Specialty Laboratories in Santa Monica. I was just a consultant there. I came in about 3 days a month, and we were working on that. And at some point, we needed to re-up our grant from the NIH to work on that, and I had to write it. And so the first line of that was, HIV is the probable cause of AIDS. And I wrote that, and then I said, well, I need a paper, some kind of scientific paper, to reference that statement, because when you make a statement like that, that's like a fact. You need to say, here's how come I know that, right? You put a little 1 if it's the first statement you've made, and then you put down at the bottom of the paper, you have a 1, and you say, here's a paper by somebody that describes why that statement's true, right? And so I said, well, what's that? Let me think about, what is that paper? Who do I go to for that? And I looked around. I asked a couple of virologists at that company, and they said, no, you don't have to reference. I said, I have to reference that because I don't know where that came from. How do I know that? And it turned out that nobody knew it. There wasn't a scientific reference, like a paper that somebody had submitted with like experimental data in it and like logical discussion and said, here's how come we know that HIV is the probable cause of AIDS. There was nothing out there like that. Nothing.
Can you talk about your experience when you met Luc Montagnier for the first time and you questioned him about his... Well, he had a reference for HIV since he is the one...
By the time I met Luc Montagnier, I had met a lot of AIDS researchers at meetings, and I had always gone up to them. If they talked like they knew about HIV and AIDS, I always went up to them afterwards and I said, where can I find a scientific reference that I can use... Remember I said I had a sentence there. It said HIV is the probable cause of AIDS, and I needed to have that backed up by something before I could write it and submit it. And I went around, I asked a whole lot of people. I said, well, the people, I can't find it. First I looked for it, just in like computer searching kind of stuff like that. But then I said, there's got to be somebody that knows this. You go to experts and ask them. And so I asked all these people one after the other, and none of them had it. None of them. And I was getting really freaked about that. That's when I first started saying, they don't know. Nobody really knows. This whole thing is a big sham. It's ridiculous. But then finally Montagnier came to there was a special little seminar down in San Diego where an old friend of Robert Gallo's, Flossie Wong-Stahl, was opening up a Department of AIDS research down in San Diego. They had lots of money involved, federal money. And they had Montagnier come there and give a talk. And after that, they had a little wine and cheese thing. And I went over to Montagnier afterwards, and I said, Dr. Montagnier, I can't find a reference. I can't find a reference to go with the statement, HIV is the probable cause of AIDS. I'm sure you can help me. And he knew that he probably should be able to help me. And he said, well, why don't you quote this new work, and by new he meant like something that came out this year, right? This new work about a virus that can kill monkeys. Or I think it was not monkeys, it was like something related to monkeys, some kind of a little ape. And I had read that, and I said, it was like supposedly going to be a model system for studying AIDS, that somebody had figured out some kind of retrovirus that passing it back and forth between various mammals, they could finally put it into chimpanzees and kill them. And it killed them in about a week, and it didn't kill them there was nothing like AIDS there, It doesn't kill you in a week. It was just totally ridiculous. None of the symptoms were the same. And I said, well, I read that paper, and I didn't see any connection between that and AIDS, and I don't think that would be I wouldn't want to use that as a reference. And I don't remember exactly what he said, but I know he walked away. Oh, no, before he told me about that paper, he said, why don't you use the NIH, like the CDC report? And I said, well, I looked at that, and that was not a scientific paper. And then he said, what about this other thing, this like paper that had just come out about a month before, and a lot of fanfare associated with that paper, but it was total crap. It was like, yeah, if you get $2 million, you can figure out how to kill a primate with a retrovirus. So what? It doesn't have anything to do with AIDS. It It didn't look like AIDS. It didn't smell like AIDS. It wasn't AIDS. It was just like, got a retrovirus that can kill a chimpanzee. So what? So I didn't get any more out of him. He walked away after that. And the people standing around, by the way, who were his colleagues there, looked at him like they were thinking he should come up with a better answer than that. But he couldn't, and he just turned around and walked away. I really thought he'd have an answer. I really did. I mean, that was my last... I was right at the edge of my faith in the system, but I thought Montagnier will know why he thinks HIV causes it, and he'll tell me. He'll say, because of this study. But he didn't have that. None of those guys have that, and that's why they're so weird, That's why they don't want dissent. They don't want people like me walking up and asking them those kind of questions, and they're willing to, go to great lengths to prevent that. They're out on a limb. I wouldn't want to be there with them.
I was given the mission to develop an HIV diagnostic test. And it was sort of an unspoken tradition at Amgen that whenever we would launch into a product development effort, that we'd invite persons from both sides of an issue. And the only person that I knew was not entirely convinced that HIV was an important target was Dr. Peter Duesberg. So I called Dr. Duesberg to come out and give a seminar at Amgen, and he agreed. And it was at that time when he had introduced his theories about other causes of AIDS and his beliefs that HIV was a harmless passenger virus. So that really is what planted the seeds in my life to start questioning the link between HIV and AIDS. And it was interesting at that seminar, the majority of the PhDs in the company actually boycotted the seminar. They had refused to come and be in the same room with Peter Duesberg. And I thought this was odd because as a scientist, we generally love vigorous arguments. And I thought that if persons had arguments against Peter Duesberg, that this would be a perfect time for them to attack him. They did, however, let the research associates come to the seminar, and it was just amazing. Everything that Dr. Duesberg had brought to my attention was completely unknown to me. And based on what he said, I was convinced that there were some serious problems with the HIV/AIDS hypothesis, if indeed what he said was true. And that prompted me to go to the library, and that was about 12 years ago, and I've been studying this issue ever since.
I remember when I made the shift myself, because for the first few years of AIDS, I was reporting on this story from the conventional perspective. And then I learned, from one reason or another, I had a chance to go into it more deeply. I spent a week in the lab of a virologist in Germany who showed me the procedures that were involved in isolating and purifying viruses, showed me why he also didn't believe that this had ever been done with HIV. And gradually I understood the intricacies of this story, and that allowed me to make the shift. But I remember being resistant to thinking that I'd been reporting this wrongly all those years. It takes a lot of, kind of movement inside to be able to change direction on such an important and emotive issue as the cause of AIDS.
From the very beginning of my medical engagement, I focused on family planning, sexual education, contraception, abortion, because I think this is the very basis of a happy life, to be able to control fertility. And in the 87, 88, we were confronted with reports that this new virus and this new disease was breaking out of the formerly so-called risk groups of gay people and hemophiliacs, and was now spreading among the heterosexual population. And I found that highly unlikely and in contradiction to everything I had learned in medicine, because the mode of transmission is predetermined and doesn't change easily. And especially to say, well, now HIV broke out of the risk group because the people inside the risk groups are almost all infected, suggests that the virus has some knowledge about how many people are infected and realizes and thinks and says, well, now I'm going to change my mode of transmission. This is like us being stuck in a car jam, in a traffic jam, and deciding suddenly, well, now we can just fly because we can't move forward with our car. It doesn't make sense. And that's when I started to ask critical questions. And I didn't get satisfying answers, so I asked even more critical questions. And in the end, I ended up to write a book, Do We Love Dangerously?, to evaluate and bring together and analyze facts about and data available on this question.
At the time, the experts were claiming, this is 1999, that there had been 250,000 deaths in that year alone, in South Africa alone. And so it struck me that if one could verify that that was true, it was obscene even to continue the debates, and that if I could prove that, which I thought was just a matter of a phone call or two, it would end the debates, and the denialists and President Mbeki would have to sort of retreat into the corner and wear dunce caps. So I went out and started looking for corpses, and that's many years ago, and I'm still looking today.
Did you find the corpses?
I didn't, and I believe that the claims then emanating from the AIDS establishment were entirely preposterous.
But how can you say that when millions of children, millions of men and women, and orphans have been said to die from AIDS?
Look, let's just step back and look at the broad picture. When I was still naive about AIDS, I used to open the newspaper and I'd read that some astronomical and dumbfounding number of Africans was infected with HIV, 24 million, 30 million, whatever. So what you discover is this doesn't imply that many people have actually been tested. is what has happened is that it's assumed that many Africans is theoretically connected via tortuous mathematical models to a woman who tested positive in a government survey.
What do you mean theoretical? Are you saying that those deaths didn't actually occur?
I can't give you a yes or no answer on that. This is a Buddhist thing. You have to... This subject requires the wisdom of a Buddhist. You have to be able to hold two possibilities in your brain at the same time. It's very difficult for most people to do. I can tell you this, however. There are no statistics elsewhere in Africa. They simply don't exist. There are simply estimates generated by people who have a vested interest in keeping this, in portraying Africa's AIDS problem as dumbfounding as possible. The sole exception is this country, South Africa. South Africa is the only country in Africa that has anything remotely approaching a vital registration system on the basis of which you can draw conclusions. So you're going to ask me about the numbers in the rest of Africa? I don't know. You can make up anything you want about most countries in Africa. Nobody would be any the wiser. It's almost impossible to check. You can sit in Geneva with your computer and generate estimates of whatever nature. They remain theoretical. This is the battleground. South Africa is the exception. It's the only country in the entire third world where it's possible to assess the accuracy of these theoretical estimates against real-life death registration.
Here is an outtake from an article I published in Spin in 1994 about Carrie Mullen's PCR, HIV, and Tony Fauci. PCR has also had a great impact on the field of AIDS, or rather, HIV research. PCR can, among other things, detect HIV in people who test negative to the HIV antibody test. The word eccentric seems to come up often in connection with Mullen's name. His first published scientific paper in the premier scientific journal Nature in 1986 described how he viewed the universe while on LSD, pocked with black holes containing antimatter for which time runs backward. He has been known to show photographs of nude girlfriends during his lectures, their bodies traced with Mandelbrot fractal patterns. And as a side project, he's developing a company which sells lockets containing the DNA of rock stars. But it is his views on AIDS that have really set the scientific establishment fuming. Mullis, like his friend and colleague Dr. Peter Duesberg, does not believe that AIDS is caused by the retrovirus HIV. He is a long-standing member of the group of reappraisal of the HIV/AIDS hypothesis, the 500-member protest organization pushing for a re-examination of the cause of AIDS. One of the Duesberg's strongest arguments in the debate has been that the HIV virus is barely detectable in people who suffer from AIDS. Ironically, when PCR was applied to HIV research around 1989, researchers claimed to have put this complaint to rest. Using the new technology, they were suddenly able to see viral particles in the quantities they couldn't see before. Scientific articles poured forth stating that HIV was now 100 times more prevalent than was previously thought. But Mullis himself was unimpressed. PCR made it easier to see that certain people are infected with HIV, he told Spin in 1992, and some of those people came down with symptoms of AIDS. But that doesn't begin to even answer the question. Does HIV cause it? Mullis then went on to echo one of Duesberg's most controversial claims. Human beings are full of retroviruses, he said. We don't know if it is 100 or thousands or hundreds of thousands. We've only recently started to look for them, but they've never killed anybody before. People have always survived retroviruses. Mullis challenged the popular wisdom that the disease-causing mechanisms of HIV are simply too mysterious to comprehend. The mystery of that damn virus, he said at the time, has been generated by 2 billion a year they spent on it. You take other virus and you spend 2 billion and you can make up some great mysteries about it too. Like so many great scientific discoveries, the idea for PCR came suddenly, as if by direct transmission from another realm. It was during a late-night drive in 1984, the same year, ironically, that HIV was announced to be the probable cause of AIDS. I was just driving and thinking about the ideas, and suddenly I saw it, Mullis recalls. I saw the polymerase chain reaction as clear as if it were upon a blackboard in my head, so I pulled over and started scribbling. A chemist friend of his was asleep in the car, and as Mullis described in a recent special edition of Scientific American, Jennifer objected groggily to the delay and the light, but I explained I had discovered something fantastic. Unimpressed, she went back to sleep. Mullis kept scribbling calculations right there in the car until the formula for DNA amplification was complete. The calculation was based on the concept of reiterative exponential growth process, which Mullis had picked up from working with computer programs. After much table pounding, he convinced the small California biotech company he was working for, I don't know how to pronounce that, Cetus, that he was onto something. Good thing they finally listened. They sold the patent for PCR to Hoffman LaRocque for the staggering sum of $300 million, the most money ever paid for by a patent. Mullis, meanwhile, received a $10,000 bonus. Mullis's mother reports that as a child, her lively son got into all kinds of trouble, shutting down the house's electricity, building rockets, and blasting small frogs hundreds of feet into the air. These days, he likes to surf, rollerblade, take pictures, party with his friends, most of whom are not scientists, and above all, he loves to write. Mullis is notoriously difficult to track down and interview. I had left several messages on his answering machine at home, but had gotten no response. Finally, I called him in the late evening as he picked up, in the middle of bidding farewell to some dinner guests. He insisted he would not give me an interview, but after a while, a conversation was underway, and I asked if I couldn't just please turn my tape recorder on. "Oh, what the hell," he gruffed. "Turn the fucker on." Oh, I hate saying curse words, sorry. Ugh. Our talk focused on AIDS, though Mullis had not been particularly vocal about his HIV skepticism. His convictions have not, to his credit, been muddled or softened by his recent success and mainstream acceptability. He seems to revel in his newly acquired power. "They can't poo-poo me now because of who I am," he says with a chuckle. And by all accounts, he's using that power effectively. When ABC's Nightline approached Mullis about participating in a documentary on himself, he instead urged them to focus their attention on the HIV debate. "That's a much more important story," he told the producers, who up to that point had never acknowledged the controversy. In the end, Nightline ran a 2-part series, the first on Kary Mullis, the second on the HIV debate. Mullis was hired by ABC for a 2-week period to act as their scientific consultant and direct them to sources. The show was superb and represented a historic turning point, possibly even the end of the 7-year media blackout on the HIV debate. But it still didn't fulfill Mullis' ultimate fantasy. What ABC needs to do, says Mullis, is talk to Chairman of the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, Dr. Anthony Fauci, and Dr. Robert Gallo, one of the discoverers of HIV, and show that they're assholes, which I could do in 10 minutes. But I point out, Gallo will refuse to discuss the HIV debate, just as he's always done. "I know he will," Mullis shoots back, anger rising in his voice. "But you know what? I would be willing to chase that little bastard from his car to his office and say, 'This is Kary Mullis trying to ask you a goddamn simple question,' and let the cameras follow. If people think I'm a crazy person, that's okay, but here's a Nobel Prize winner trying to ask a simple question from those who spent $22 billion and killed 100,000 people. It has to be on TV. It's a visual thing. I'm not unwilling to do something like that." He pauses, then continues, "And I don't care about making an ass of myself because most people realize I am one." While many people, even within the ranks of the HIV dissidents, have a late tried to distance themselves from the controversial Duesberg, Mullis defends him passionately and sees genuinely concerned about his fate. "I was trying to stress this point to the ABC people," he says, "that Peter has been abused seriously by the scientific establishment to the point where he can't do any research. Not only that, but his whole life is pretty much in disarray because of this, and it is only because he has refused to compromise his scientific moral standards. There ought to be some goddamn private foundation in the country that would say, well, we'll move in where the NIH, National Institution of Health, dropped off. We'll take care of it. You just keep right on saying what you're saying, Peter. We think you're an asshole and we think you're wrong, but you're the only dissenter and we need one because it's science. It's not religion." And that was one of the reasons why I cooperated with ABC. "I'm waiting to be convinced that we're wrong," Mullis continues. "I know it ain't going to happen, but if it does, I will tell you this much. I will be the first person to admit it. A lot of people studying this disease are looking for the clever little pathways they can piece together that will show how this works. Like, what if this molecule was produced by this one, and then this one, by this one, and then what if this one, and that one, induces this one? That stuff becomes, after two molecules, conjecture of the rankest kind. People who sit there and talk about it don't realize that molecules themselves are somewhat hypothetical, and that their interactions are more so, and that the biological reactions are even more so. You don't need to look that far. You don't discover the cause of something like AIDS by dealing with incredibly obscure things. You just look at what the hell is going on. Well, here's a bunch of people that are practicing a new set of behavioral norms. Apparently, it didn't work because a lot of them got sick. And that's the conclusion. You don't necessarily know why it happened, but you start there. That was a historical detour, shared in hopes of rooting this conversation historically. When you see the word cases on your TV screen, in this world that has now been hijacked by one single event, one dread, one idol, you'll be forgiven for thinking those are cases of you-know-what. The number of cases is often a very big number, backlit in red. Today, for example, the number of total cases in the U.S., according to the world meter, is 309,728. The total death figure is 8,441. Active cases, 286,546, of which 8,206 are serious critical. The number of new deaths is 1,037, and the number of total recovered is 14,741. I'm not clear what an active case is. Does that mean fully symptomatic? Partially symptomatic? If the latter, it surely encompasses influenza, pneumonia, which is magically, as many have observed, dropped off a cliff for 2020. In China, generally, they diagnose the thing that I was going to say is the you-know-what with CT scans and 1 or 2 positive PCR tests. In the U.S., it's difficult to find out what makes a case, i.e. what case definition is. Absent CT scans, we are in a biotech freefall. One website offers the distressingly unclear definition. The novel you-know-what, or you-know-what 19, has been spreading worldwide, resulting in growing numbers of infected individuals since late 2019 and increased mortality numbers since early 2020. So far, experts have seen that while there are severe cases, the infection is usually mild with non-specific symptoms. And there are no trademark clinical features of you-know-what infection. There are no trademark clinical features? What then collapsed the world? I sure hope this isn't all riding on a test, as biotech oracle. A few graphs down, my fears are confirmed. Diagnosis of you-know-what involves laboratory tests. Once someone has been diagnosed with the you-know-what, additional diagnostic tests may be done to determine the severity of the infection. I accept that something is going on that overlaps with flu, but reportedly worse than a normal flu. That's what we're hearing. It involves an acute lack of oxygen for reasons unclear. People can't breathe. Intubation is a serious, potentially dangerous procedure that begs many questions, but that's for a future article. What is the relationship between the spread of the testing and the spread of a new virus? How do we know what we're experiencing in comparison to what we're assuming we're experiencing? One study in Austria found that increased testing correlated with, no surprise, increased cases. In an email discussed between a group of international scientists, academics, and MDs, the question was posed whether the daily number of new cases would track with the daily number of tests. Yes, they do, wrote Austrian MD Christian Fiala. Here are the data from Austria. In other words, if they want to further increase the number of infected people, they have to also increase the number of tests. However, that is physically impossible. Another aspect, during the first weeks, most tests were done on sick people. Therefore, the percentage of positive tests was relatively high. But there are not so many sick people, and with the general rollout of tests, the vast majority of these tests will be healthy. Consequently, the percentage of positive tests will be low, and most will be false positive. In other words, it is impossible to continue to increase of positive test results. In the U.S., we have all but abandoned classical diagnostic medicine in favor of biotech, or lab result medicine. This has been going on for a long time and is a dangerous turning. The you-know-what test is named with characteristic tactidium, and then it says CDC 2019 and then I don't want to say the rest for reasons you know why. Real-time RT-PCR diagnostic panel. I guess that's the name of the test. That means it is a needle in a DNA haystack test, a PCR test. It finds fragments, nucleic acids, from an email from Kary Mullis to the widow of boxer Tommy Morrison, whose career and life were destroyed by an HIV test, and who litigated ferociously for years against test manufacturers. Dr. Mullis wrote on May 7, 2013, PCR detects a very small segment of the nucleic acid which is part of a virus itself. The specific fragment detected is determined by the somewhat arbitrary choice of DNA primers, which used, which become the ends of the amplified fragment. If things were done right, so-called infection would be a far cry from a positive PCR test. You have to have a whopping amount of organism to cause symptoms. Huge amounts of it. Dr. David Raznick, biochemist, protease developer, and former founder of an EM lab called Viral Forensics, told me, you don't start with testing, you start with listening to the lungs. I'm skeptic that the PCR test is ever true. It's a great scientific research tool. It's a horrible tool for clinical medicine. 30% of your infected cells have been killed before you show symptoms. By the time you show symptoms, the dead cells are generating the symptoms. I asked Dr. Raznick what advice he has for people who want to be tested for you know what. Don't do it, I say, when people ask me, he replies. No healthy person should be tested. It means nothing, but it can destroy your life, make you absolutely miserable. One of the countless head-spinning mysteries of this whole you-know-what situation has been the advent of famous people, from Tom Hanks to his wife, to Sophie Trudeau, to Prince Charles, announcing they had tested positive for you-know-what and were self-quarantined. In all these famous powerful people cases, the symptoms were either non-existent or mild. Why, one wondered, did they make such a hay about it? The British royals especially seemed to contradict their ethos of secrecy in this case. So what did it mean? It signaled, if anything, that you-know-what is not all that deadly, that the virus can be present without causing the disease, that host factors matter, and that being positive for you-know-what is neither a PR death sentence nor an actual death sentence. Maybe in their elite and esoteric language, it means some kind of prestige or sacrament to a pagan virus deity. Who knows? In the case of the Trudeau, Sophie tested positive and had symptoms, while her husband, Justin, the Prime Minister, never got sick and was never tested. He didn't want to appear privileged. Not everybody can get tested in Canada. You must have symptoms. We do live now in a world dominated by a you-know-what, as my friend Kevin Corbet, a retired nurse in the UK, puts it, with knobs on it. Shrek green is the color that was chosen. We're lost in a simulation, seeking to grab hold of truth and reality. One way that I do that is to grab hold of words, slow them down, and analyze them. Globalists love to weaponize words and make spells out of them. Hypnotics. To this end, they invent new words and force you to use them and live them. Words like, you-know-what, and social distancing. You-know-what, tested positive. Whether we realize it or not, this phrase is an echo of HIV think, which I swam through for most of my so-called career in journalism, choking and spitting all the way out. The globalists write code. They encode viruses and give them a weaponized video game identity. In this video game, you lose all your freedoms and you must display gratitude and servitude. Viral code trumps all other forms of politics. Nothing can counter it, especially not science. The virus is also a sweeping metaphor for the spread of so-called misinformation, which means anything outside their religious doctrines not recognizable by classical virology. The code, the potential scenarios, the mysticism and superstition about how the virus spreads must not be questioned if you wish to remain a person, as opposed to an unperson. It's a form of post-globalist environmental socialism gone malignant. Demand that all people submit to an equal chance